welcome back. So, Special Spiral 4 is a thing now, and that's really cool. It's basically null damage reduction in your B slot if you can get your special off, which means now mages and other units that couldn't access stuff with damage reduction nullification properties for their special or anything in that regard can run that now at the cost of their B slot. And because of that, I did want to highlight some notable candidates for this skill if you do plan to fodder it to somebody. Now, if you plan to just give this to your favorite or whatever, then more power to you. But for those looking to give this to somebody who will function a lot better with it, well, I have a list for you that we'll go over. I'll preface this now by saying this isn't going to contain every single option on the list, because a majority of them either are generic or they just fall into the arcane pitfall where they basically just want to use that over anything else. But I did note down a good amount of units that I think would use the skill really, really well, or units that don't want the skill whatsoever. And beyond that, I listed some of the arcane weaponry in the tier list itself. So if you did want to give it to somebody maybe like a generic swordie with arcane sword or whatever, well, then you'll know where at least I'm thinking they go. But nevertheless, we may as well just get started with the list, starting with the top 4 candidates for Special Spiral, in my opinion. Legendary Female Byleth, Ascended Celica, Ascended Ishtar, and Brave Lysithea. The first two have the tempo effect and slaying, meaning that it's going to be pretty consistent in just getting a special off, so in that regard it's going to be really, really nice. Byleth does appreciate being on some sort of catchable team, so she doesn't get one shot in retaliation, especially since she is giving up her B slot for Special Spiral 4, meaning that she can't run stuff like Wind Sweep or Water Sweep. But in Celica's case, she does have the Miracle effect present, meaning that she can initiate combat with no issue whatsoever. And while she does lose out on Soul of Zofia from her B slot, meaning that she doesn't get the Desperation effect in further combats, she can still run no follow-up in her Sacred Seal, or you could just run anything else that boosts stats. So that way, at the very least, she could secure her own doubles and get a fair amount of damage out, especially against units that can just soak any single hit with damage reduction properties. Meanwhile, with Ascended Ishtar and Brave Lysithea, Ascended Ishtar has her Brave attacks, which can be really, really convenient, especially in a scenario where you don't even have to run her on a catchable team. She could just initiate combat, attack twice, and at that point, if she's able to get a special off, which she'll be able to because she does have the tempo and slaying effect, then the foe won't be able to tank it unless they have Hardy Fighter. And Brave Lysithea, who recently got a refine, has her own Slaying, Flashing Blade, Desperation effect with a bunch of attack and speed. And while she doesn't have tempo necessarily, she does have Flashing Blade in her weapon. So even with guard effects present, she could still get a special off very consistently and charge any high cooldown special with Special Spiral 4 in mind. And with the no follow-up seal being a thing and her ability to warp and the guaranteed follow-up, I would argue she's probably one of the best users of this. Now, she could still get her guaranteed follow-up shut down by anything that has a no follow-up effect, and then if you have some sort of wary effect after that point, then it probably won't work out for her. But in most scenarios, it's really not going to be the case. The only one that I can really think of that fulfills that niche is Halloween Duma. But even with that being the case, you could still run the no follow-up seal, and you could still double through it. And in my opinion, these are probably going to be the best 4 candidates when it comes to using the Special Spiral 4 B slot, especially since they all target the res stat, which happens to be lower in most scenarios than the defense stat. Of course, outside of just the must-have category, I have a fair amount of units in the solid user category. And a good amount of them also fulfill a similar niche with God Swords and all that stuff. But for standout units such as Arvel, Asker, Bramimond, Owain, I think there's a lot of stuff worth highlighting there specifically. So for Arvel's case, they have a guaranteed follow-up in their duality, but they also have a triangle effectiveness against every single color that isn't colorless, meaning that their matchups are generally going to be really, really good. So with Special Spiral 4 in mind, as long as they are able to get a special going, there's no chance in hell that any foe is going to be able to tank them. And again, because we have the no follow-up seal, they can secure their own guaranteed follow-up, as long as the foe doesn't have no follow-up themselves. Meanwhile, with Asker, he's definitely a lot more interesting because he has Slaying with Tempo and Open Domain. So with Ignis, it becomes a 2 cooldown special, and so long as he's able to double in the first combat, he'll get Ignis off, and then it'll just loop after that point, at 1 cooldown, and every retaliation after that point will always be an Ignis. And that could be really absurdly strong, especially in scenarios where the foe could potentially dodge tank it or just reduce it with any sort of damage reduction. With Ignis from an Asker, it's most likely not going to happen. You also have Bramimond, who has his Impenetrable Dark, which basically shuts down any sort of external support. It's basically the Omni feud before we had feuds. And while Bramimond isn't necessarily the most threatening unit nowadays, he can still do decent amounts of work thanks to the fact that he does have his Omni-Feud effect, which is really, really convenient. And with Special Spiral and Moonbow, he should be able to shred through pretty much a lot of stuff, especially if they don't have Hardy Fighter. And Hardy Fighter is probably going to be the only counter currently that we have in the game that can go against this stuff, because it doesn't get negated by Special Spiral. You could also use this on Halloween Male Corrin, who has a slaying weapon with 75% damage reduction on the foe's first hit. So he's basically Infantry Valentine's Gustav, with the added benefit of being an infantry, meaning that he doesn't have any sort of class weakness outside of Dragon Effectiveness. But even with that being the case, he still has 75% damage reduction, and with Special Spiral 4 and the Slaying, he should be able to retaliate with an instant Draconic Aura and hit for a really hard amount. And while he will lose out on any sort of guaranteed follow-up, you could always run the Quick Riposte Seal instead, and then run external breath support, whether that's from Ana, or New Year Valoria, or Thor. Regardless, Corrin's sustainability and tanking prowess, combined with a really good min-max stat line, makes me think that they can actually use this skill really, really well. You also have Dual Ephraim, who recently got his own refine, which grants a lot of stuff. It has Kanto remaining +1, it has Even Tempest, it has a lot of stats, armor and cav effectiveness, and really the only thing that's going to stop him from just getting general damage out is damage reduction, because he hits like a truck. Even without all the merges and the flowers, he's still going to hit really, really, really hard, especially with the effectiveness that's towed into Reagan Leaf. So having Special Spiral 4 in his B slot with the no follow-up seal means that he'll always be able to get a consistent amount of damage out. And while you will lose out on stuff that could otherwise benefit him for hit and run purposes, maybe like close call or hit and run, he could still secure more damage output with this, especially if you were to go up against maybe stuff like Fallen Edelgard, where he may not necessarily be able to one-shot on the first hit, unless she's untransformed or some other scenario, but with Special Spiral 4 and Ruptured Sky, she's going to go down immediately. And one of the other highlights is definitely going to be Kronia, who also recently got a refine with her own Vantage weapon, which is really convenient. It does lack slaying, which means it will limit the amount of specials she can use, but Ruptured Sky can still do quite well for her. And with Special Spiral 4, she doesn't really have to worry about sacking her B slot for anything else because of the fact that she has Vantage in her weapon. If anything, maybe for stuff like Null Sea Disrupt purposes, but that's really, really rare. But with Special Spiral 4 and Ruptured Sky, she will always be able to retaliate first with a special, and with her exposure and additional damage that she gets from her weapon, she'll be able to hit really, really hard. Other notable options include Lewin and Legendary Lyn. Lewin, who has his reverse Desperation effect, which aged quite well considering that now he has a free B slot for pretty much anything. It could be Tempo, or it could even be the new Special Spiral 4. But with Time's Pulse, the Forseti, and no follow-up seal, he'll always be able to get a Moonbow out with damage reduction nullification properties as long as the foe doesn't have guard. And even then, you could always work around that, whether you give him Flashing Blade, or Visible no follow-up, and then some other C slot, or Sacred Seal, or whatever the case may be. He'll be able to work around it. He has the flexibility. Meanwhile, with Legendary Lyn, she has Fire Sweep in her A slot against all units that can attack her defense stat, I believe. Or they're all one ranged. Regardless, she has a Fire Sweep effect, and with Swift Mulligar also having the Bramimend Impenetrable Dark effect, she'll be able to actually output a fair amount of damage, especially since the foe won't be able to get any sort of supportive capability since, again, Swift Mulligar nullifies it. You also have Young Mia and Monica, the former who has Slaying, Null Follow-Up, Damage Reduction, Phantom Speed, Spectrum 5, a lot of stuff in their weapon, and they really have every B slot to work with because everything is just built into their weapon. What else do they really need at the end of the day? So, you may as well give them Special Spiral 4, have an Instant Luna immediately, although you could always go with Vital Astra, even though that might not necessarily be as good because you're losing on a fair amount of damage. Still, extra damage reduction is always nice, but with Special Spiral 4 and Luna, her damage output's going to be really, really, really high. And with Monica in particular, she has a lot of attack and speed from her Wind Genesis and the Desperation effect with Slaying. So she'll be able to initiate combat, get 2 attacks out before the foe can counterattack unless they have Vantage. Assuming that isn't the case, she'll get 2 attacks out, and with Flashing Blade, she'll be able to get Luna off on the second hit, assuming, again, no guard effects, which you can still work around. And in every combat after that point, you basically have Luna on the first hit, which will be really nice. And the other 2 units I want to highlight are Owain and Yuri. When Owain got his Mistletoe refine, it definitely could have used a bit more work because we didn't have as many options to work with way back then. But over the course of who knows how long when he got his refine, the weapon aged considerably well, especially now that we have stuff like Speed Smoke 4 and Null Follow-Up Seal. He can afford to run Special Spiral 4 in his B slot. And with the Mistletoe effect that he gets from, well, Mistletoe, which is just foes hit, does yada yada yada, he can set up something like Aether, and then every time the foe initiates combat, he'll always be able to retaliate with an instant Aether, meaning that his sustainability is going to be really, really high, his damage output is still going to be really, really good, and you will still get damage reduction and no follow-up effects. And with Yuri, well, you can still run Lethality set, which will probably work out in some scenarios better than others. Because of the amount of cooldown required to charge Lethality, you can afford to go with something that has less cooldown properties, such as Luna, and while it's not going to deal as much as Lethality, you still will be able to get it out much more consistently and much more often. Although you will want to run some sort of external support to have the second charge ready to go. But if you could get that going, then he'll be a really solid Special Spiral 4 user. And those are really the ones I wanted to highlight from the solid user category. You definitely have other options, but they kind of follow a similar suit, whether that's Legendary Roy or Rutger with their own damage reduction Godsword stuff, or even Male Shez, who has a dual phase Brave effect, which is really good, especially compared to a lot of his other contemporaries, seeing that he also has damage reduction properties in Crimson Blades, albeit with a bulk penalty. Still, with the damage reduction in tow and the breath effect, he'll be able to get Special Spiral 4 off way more consistently, and his sustainability is just going to be a lot better overall, which is why I have him above all the other dual phase Brave units, especially now that we have the Wyvern weapons, which is going to make up a good amount of reason why a lot of the dual phase Brave users are in the works well category. And that isn't to say that they're generally weak, but comparatively to units with a modern stat line or just units with a better overall stat line, they can use something like Wyvern Katana or Wyvern Yumi, and they can probably get a fair amount of effects going way faster and way more consistently with little repercussions comparatively. So even with stuff like Arden, who has a really decent PRF in Arden's Blade, which grants guard and stats in dual phase Brave, you can just run any sort of min-max armor. You won't necessarily fall to stuff that targets the res stat, and you'll be better for it comparatively. But for what it's worth, Arden can still hit really, really hard, and that's probably one of the bigger benefits when it comes to units with a PRF dual phase Brave weapon, is that even with the Wyvern weapons existing, they're generally going to be hitting harder because the might penalty is not as stagnant as the Wyvern weapons. Still, you can easily make do with a lot of other units that can fulfill a similar niche with the Inheritable. Meanwhile, you also have Kanas, who has his Ancient Codex, which grants a quick and pulse effect for the first 3 turns, so with Time Pulse you can have an instant Moonbow ready to go, and because Ancient Codex allows him to hit absurdly hard, with Special Spiral 4, there's no chance that any foe's really going to be able to tank him unless they have Hardy Fighter. You also have stuff like Valentine's Hector and Ascended Joshua, the former who can retaliate with a really strong hitting Ignis, although the setup will be a bit more tedious. Even with the slaying effect, you will still need an additional charge, and you will be losing out any sort of guaranteed follow-up from your B slot, but if you are just relying on one-shots, you can easily do it. And for a lot of the speedier units in the game anyway, there's a good chance they have a no follow-up effect present, so even with the guaranteed follow-up missing, there's a good chance they weren't going to double anyway. But you also have units like Ascended Joshua who can use this pretty well, even though they could also use stuff like Lethality with Time Pulse and all that stuff. You don't necessarily have to run Flashing Blade, which is really convenient. That aside, with Time Pulse and external charge, or even just charging it in an initial combat, they'll be able to get Luna going and looping, pretty much akin to all the other units. You also have Keaton and Kaiza, the former who has Breath in their weapon, Dual Phase Brave, and Tempo. It's a really strong combination. And they can act pretty well as a melee specialist, assuming that no dragon really initiates on him, because if they do, there's a good chance he's just going to fall in combat, or they're just going to do a really big chunk to him. But even with that being the case, he can retaliate with an instant Ignis, which will do an absurd amount of damage to the foe. And then with Kaiser, they can basically do the same thing because they have the Mistletoe effect in their Polished Fang, but they do lack the Dual Phase Brave effect. But for what it's worth, they have much more res to work with, which can actually work in some scenarios where you do have to eat a hit from maybe a dragon, for example. And before we get to the generics, I do want to talk about Winter Marth, who also recently got his refine, which is basically a reverse dive bomb with speed preempt. With Special Spiral 4 in tow, they can always get 2 attacks out before the foe can get their first attack out, meaning that the first hit could always just be a mini Deadeye based on speed from Fire Emblem. And that could be really strong, in all honesty. The only caveat is just losing out on any sort of stuff like Savvy Fighter, which means that if you do have to eat a hit, or if the foe has any sort of impact effect, then they're only going to be able to attack once. But if you can set up Special Spiral, then there's a good chance that they can, in fact, one-shot with Fire Emblem. But on the generic side, you could always just use any sort of fast bow infantry with Whitecap bow and Special Spiral, and with Luna until it might actually do a bit more in terms of damage output comparatively to something like Deadeye. Because Deadeye scales based on how much damage you're already doing versus Luna, which will reduce the foe's defense or res by 50% during combat, Luna with Whitecap and Special Spiral might end up doing more than Deadeye. Although you could also give this to any sort of unit with an arcane, whether that's a sword, you could stack up their attack and speed, run no follow-up, basically do the same thing as you were doing with Owain, although I still think Owain does it a bit better. Even if he doesn't have the guaranteed follow-up, he does have the breath effect, and he gets an additional amount of damage based on how much damage he took. I think he does it a bit better, but you can still replicate a fair amount of it with the Arcane Sword. And with the Arcane Axe, you can actually get instant Aethers out because of the breath effect that it comes with, which is really convenient. You don't get any sort of guaranteed follow-up from it, and it does have follow-up prevention, so you will want somebody that is a bit faster for this. Or anybody that can realistically speed stack. So even maybe someone like Groom Hinata with a speed refine, you can stack up the speed pretty easily. And beyond that, you have the Arcane Grima and the recently released Arcane Eclipse. The former that has a guaranteed follow-up, additional true damage based on the unit's attack for the first attack, and all sorts of other stuff, including healing and, yeah, slaying and all that stuff. So if you were to give this to any sort of generic dragon, or even units that would prefer Arcane Grima over their PRF, you can set up Special Spiral 4 quite easily, and because they have access to the Distant Counter Sacred Seal, they can be a lot more flexible in combat, which is convenient. And then for the red tomes, basically any sort of high attack unit, it has the quick and pulse effect, so running Times Pulse with it, you can basically charge up Luna and have it ready to go. If you've already seen Rearmed Ophelia, you know how it works. It's basically going to be the same thing for any other unit with a high attack set. Really, that's going to be about it in terms of the notable candidates. I probably glossed over a fair amount of them that could have easily had an explanation too, or could have been on the list. But for the most part, they generally fulfill the same niche, and I basically would have been repeating myself at that point, maybe like no follow-up blades and all that stuff. Basically, if they can fulfill a similar niche with any of these weapons or any of these units, they could probably use Special Spiral 4 pretty well. But before we close it off, I do want to talk about a few units you probably don't want to give it to, including Black Knight and Zelgius, who definitely prefer running Savvy Fighter because their overall bulk is really minuscule comparatively to the likes of Arden. Even though both of them don't really have the best res anyway, Arden has a lot more defense to work with, meaning that if he had to eat a physical hit, he'll have a better shot at doing that than someone like Black Knight or Zelgius. Soleil, you could always give it to her, but you would have to replace her Pyrrha for the Arcane, and you could basically run her that way. She basically falls in between these two categories, but for the most part, you could basically do the same thing. Julius has a pretty decent weapon already, and he does rely on any sort of guaranteed follow-up or speed stack, which is why I don't think stacking his B slot for Special Spiral 4 is going to be the way to go, especially since he's going to be acting more in the enemy phase. And Brave Alm, who has a lot of flexibility when it comes to their B slot, I personally find that you could use Special Spiral 4, but it will ultimately depend on the set and the game mode that you use it in, because you're giving up a fair amount of stuff, including hit and run potential with maybe Close Call or Hit and Run, or even other B slots that could be way more beneficial for him in terms of just overall damage output instead of Special Spiral. And he's already hitting like a truck anyway because Sense Scale with his PRF is just absurd. And just a final note, for the not worth category, they basically have better B slots to work with, or they don't want it because they already have damage reduction nullifications properties in their kit, such as Legendary Alm with Lunar Flash, Winter Altina with Twin Blades, Azura, well, she's a dancer. I don't really know if you'd want to give it to a dancer, but if you do, just arcane it, basically. Kanagus and all other defensive armors, you basically just want to use as a defensive armor. Crom, he can set up his own Deadeye. Corrin with Negating Fang. Edelgard with Black Eagle Rule. Summer Edelgard with Raging Storm, or if you want to play defensively, Hardy Fighter. They're not going to struggle to deal damage anyway, especially since they have dual phase Brave and Slaying. Flavia, who also has damage reduction nullification on special. Kaze might be a standout here, because you could always give it to him, but I find with Kaze's Needle, he doesn't really need it, especially since he's one of the best lethality users in the game currently. Same with Volk, same with Tyne, Soren, Euler, so on and so forth. If there are units that I did miss on this list, or you want me to at least talk about, let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll try and get to them as soon as I can. But this is basically my Special Spiral 4 tier list, and if you do plan to father it to somebody, I'm curious on who. That being said, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.